I need to add this to my growing diatribe of notes that I'm compilating in terms of just general discussion and arguments about the failing culture and the decadence, that facilitates the kind of the corruption and failure of management and political leadership, or governmental management and leadership in general. But and I'm just making a list of all these things of the kind of the mismanagement of the judiciary and the corruption of the judiciary in terms of the legal theory itself, which has conformed to the fascistic conception of things under the guise of this sort of social justice culture, which is really indistinguishable from the fascistic worldview, categorizing people by factions. It's a new form of tribalism, really. But another element to all of this is activism. Activism is a very interesting sort of thing. Effectively, what activism is, and activism, within a certain bound, within a certain sort of principled context, it does have a place. But if it's overused, it's essentially worthless. Although it's not worthless because it does it's not worthless according to the intentions of those who are misusing it at the moment, because it is actually creating a greater sense of destabilization, which seeks to sort of what would the word be? Make room for a kind of authoritarianism, which is characteristic of this hysterical hyperactivism. There's so much activism constantly, and effectively, what activism is at its fundamental core is that it is it's a call on authority to take belonging of the activism. Activism is a form of invitation to be adopted as a ruling ideology. I need to find perhaps a slightly more succinct thing, but that is basically it. Like, activism is demanding that some authority adopts its ideas and adopts that activism as its project and as its spirits and such. And so, I guess my real complaint is that all of this activism is effectively part of this new tribalism, this new balkanization within society that sort of starts to create the conditions of that sort of perpetual civil war that all fascistic societies are culturally premised in. It's fundamentally at war with its own internal civilian elements of its civilian population that are scapegoated in this narrative that becomes the simplification of all issues into something like identity. I mean, what were the Nazis if they weren't the liberal progressive echo chamber of identity politics of their time? That's exactly what they were. And then I was just, the point about management I've actually there was a longer sort of diatribe that attaches to that was in my notes. And then I also wanted to say something about, there's so many things, in which the management of everything is so poor, and the ideology makes it, the moral corruption makes it impossible to actually do anything about it effectively. And it just facilitates state corruption on a massive level as well. But I was thinking that essentially, this seems like to me like a practical idea. is that in terms of policing, what you could do is you could force police districts to cover area. They could almost swap themselves. That you sort of, the personnel of a district sort of, in terms of the paperwork, it probably would be too much, except if you could disassociate it from the detectives maybe. I don't know how many detectives are thought that they could be corrupt. But, you know, in terms of dealing with the police that are taking money from gangsters, that effectively, if you got people to swap their policing, I mean, even if they didn't relocate districts, but they just covered different districts, and they had to have people on the ground in that district so that, you know, they could effectively police, you know, because you don't want to extend call-out times effectively. But if you just got different personnel to police different areas, then the gangs would have to pay off two sets of police effectively. And so at least that would either force the gangs to become one gang, and then you would have an organized crime that would perhaps be easier to take down as a single enemy other than this Hydra. But effectively then they wouldn't be able to bribe all those policemen. They wouldn't, you know, well, I mean, that's an idea, I guess, but just mixing it up like that. Or you could have, I mean, in terms of a grand system, in terms of you reorganize it so you have competitive policing, so that you have competition between police forces and the better one sort of wins out somehow. But that might be a bit too tricky. But I mean, yeah, it just seems, you know, how there can be things like gangs that aren't being dealt with. It just seems, you know, you either have a plan to deal with the problem that exists, or, you know, you make, at least you make one squad that is capable of dealing with that problem, and then you move that squad to fix that problem, and then they move on to the next problem zone. So you've got this sort of fixer squad or something like that. I mean, how hard is it to actually conceive of a plan that actually fixes a specific solution? You know, it shouldn't be that hard to envisage and make provision and sort of, you know, but where is the leadership? Where is the management? It just doesn't exist in this country. You know, even within substandard resourcing or whatever, there should still be something that can be done in terms of increasing effectiveness, or at least being effective with what is on hand, with what is available. You know, there are things that can be done. Just the solution to this is just essentially not having bad management of things. It's just sort of, you know, which is effectively what destroys the National Health Service.